Hello, everyone. Professor Sexton here with our video lecture on two poems, Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays and Theodore Roethke's My Papa's Waltz. The reason why I'm combining both of these poems in the same video lecture is that they have the same subject. Keep in mind, the subject is the topic that the poem is about. And so they're both about father-son relationships. Now, when you are looking at the theme of these two poems, you got to think about what does the poem say about father-son relationships? I am not going to tell you in this video lecture what the themes of these two poems are. And the main reason why that I'm not doing that is that that becomes a matter of interpretation. And one of the things that I want to emphasize in this class is that we're doing literary analysis. And with literary analysis, there is no right or wrong answer. What works is how well you use terminologies and elements of a literary work to support your interpretation. So, for some of you, you might look at the relationship between the father and son in My Papa's Waltz as being a very good one. That would be your focus. And as long as you can support why you hold that viewpoint, that works. For others of you, you might look at that relationship between the father and son in that poem as a negative relationship, which is totally fine. However, what you'll want to do is you'll want to support why it is that you view it that way. And some of the ways that you will do that is by using literary terminology, such as diction, word choice, imagery, what comes to your mind, what do you hear, what do you see when you're reading the poem. So let me begin first by sharing with you the first one, which we're going to do those winter Sundays. So it should be coming up. Here we are, and let me just enlarge that. So this is Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays. I want you to take a note that right outside the title, you see a date. That is the publication date. That is not necessarily the date that Hayden wrote the poem, but it is the date that the poem was published. And a lot of times, indication of publication tells you something about the time period. And so maybe this is a relationship between a father and son in the 1970s. And so when you're reading about this relationship, maybe knowing about the 1970s will influence your interpretation. Let me, before I read the entire poem, I just want to point out two things that were in the literary terminology. Notice the first line, Sundays too, my father got up early. This is an issue of syntax. In the typical English sentence, we would not make this statement this way. We would say, my father got up early also on Sundays, because what we tend to do is we tend to put the subject first and then the verb. But this, Hayden has inverted the syntax here. Whenever a poet inverts syntax, ask yourself why that poet is doing that. And I'll come back to this in a moment. Also, remember in the poetic terminology, I talked about the word enjambment. So let me show you here. So this is the first line of that poem. And so notice that there is no punctuation mark after the word early. This is enjambment because when you read this on into the next line. So let me do this. Let me read through the entire poem now with you. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black coat. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made bank fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'll awake and hear the cold splintering breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'll call. And slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So it's a very simple poem in the sense that it's composed of 14 lines. But what you can see is that it is a poem about a relationship between a father and a son. What you notice in the first stanza, and this stanza is this first unit here. So you notice that you have these 6 lines, I'm sorry, 5 lines here. That's in one unit, that's a stanza. This is your second stanza, and this is your third stanza. So in this first stanza, notice when we talked about syntax. So in the syntax, what Hayden does is he starts with Sunday 2, my father got up early. And the reason why he does this, in the 1970s, Sundays were still a day of rest or a day that you went to church. It's not a day that most people worked because during that time period, you had Sundays off. So by Hayden having the speaker begin this poem with Sundays 2, my father got up early. What it initially says to us right away is that this is a father who works 7 days a week. Notice also that the father puts his clothes on the blue black coat, and then with cracked hands that ache from labor in the weekday weather. That line is, those lines are important because it lets us know that the father is someone who does manual labor, right? Because his hands are cracked. Then, and we have labor. But then we also know that he works outside because in the weekday weather. So this is not a father who works an office job. This is a father who works outside with his hands. But what is significant here is that despite this father working like that on his labor job, he also does this work for his family. But then here's the clincher. Notice that at the end of line 5, it ends with no one ever thanked him. Notice too punctuation here. Like so here in line 2, you have the comma. Then there's no end stop here. There's no end stop here. So after this, you read this all together. And that's a lot to read in a mouthful. So listen to it. Then with cracked hands that ache from labor in the weekday weather made bank fires blaze. Then you stop. No one ever thanked him. And then you stop. By Hayden doing that with that no one ever thanked them, it emphasizes that. And that tells you too something about the relationship between this father and this son. Now, this is where I'm going to stop, and I'm not going to tell you the interpretation here because this is something that I want you to figure out for yourself. And keep in mind, these are interpretations. So what you'll do is you'll look at the poem yourself and figure out how you read this relationship. But notice in the second stanza, we have the speaker. And keep in mind that the speaker of this poem is a son. We don't know how old he is. And all we can do is make assumptions. And this is my interpretation, I normally assume that during these experiences that the boys may be 14 or 15. But there's nothing in the poem that tells me that. That's just an assumption that I am making. But notice where the speaker says, I'll wake and hear the coals splittering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'll call, and slowly I would rise and dress. So what you see here is that even though no one is thanking the father for the work that he's done, he has made sure that that house is warm for the rest of the family that wakes up. And one thing that's really interesting too about the poem is you don't know who the rest of this family is. And it's tricky because sometimes you think that it's only the father and son because he says, and slowly I would rise and dress. But if you go back to the end of the line 5, he says, no one ever thanked him. And so you get the sense, or I get the sense that there's more than one person in this house. For some reason, my file wanted, so it's back up. Sorry about that. You get the sense that there is more than one person in this house. But then notice too, just the way that the first stanza ended with that no one ever thanked him, the last stanza ends with fearing the chronic angers of that house. It's a line that Hayden puts there, but he doesn't go into a lot of details there. And then this becomes something for us as readers to figure out. What are the chronic angers of that house? Are there angers that exist between the different members of the house? Well, meaning the way that the line is written, it makes it seem as if the house itself is angry, which is a sense of personification. But I don't think that's what that means. I don't think the house is angry. But notice how the line of the third stanza starts, speaking indifferently to him. Who is speaking indifferently to him? Placement makes it seem like the house is speaking indifferently to him, but perhaps it's the son speaking indifferently to him. Or maybe if the house is a symbol for everyone who lives there, then everyone in the house is speaking indifferently to him. So once again, it shows this relationship between the father, the son, or the father and the other members of the household. And then it tells you what the father has done, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. So there's an acknowledgement from the speaker that this father does a lot for this family. But at the same time, there's also an acknowledgement that no one ever thanked him and the sense of speaking indifferently to him. The last two lines of the poem are very significant. Notice in line 13, where you have that repetition of, what did I know? What did I know? That repetition to me reads as a sense of remorse, regret. What did I know? What did I know? Then of love's austere and lonely offices. Austere is a word that you'll need to look up. I am not going to give you that definition. I want you to look that up and then come back to the poem and look at it. But it seems like there's a sense of regret here in this speaker's voice. And this is my interpretation. When I get to the last stanza, I assume that the speaker is older in the last stanza than what he was in stanza 1 and stanza 2. I get a sense that he's older now and he's reflecting back. Because keep in mind, the poem is told in the past tense. My father got up, put, made. So we get the past tense, were. So we get the sense, or I get the sense, that what we have here is a speaker looking back. And my sense is that maybe the speaker is much older in the last stanza. And now he has a better understanding of what it is that his father did for him and how his father showed love. And let me address one other thing. Notice that throughout the poem, I've been saying that this is a son and that the speaker is a male son. The only reason why I said that, only reason, is something about polished my good shoes. When I get that line, I think to myself, it is mostly men's shoes that are polished. Now, keep in mind, I understand that some girls' shoes can be polished as well, but for some reason in my head, I'm assuming that this is a son speaking. There is nothing in the poem that says that this is a son. And this is the thing that we have to think about when we think about persona and speaker. And this is the thing that you have to be careful with. Now, we see the name of the poet and we see Robert Hayden. And so we assume, and I'll just tell you, Robert is a male. And I think what a lot of us tend to do when we read poetry, we actually always assume that the poet and the voice of the poem are the same people. You want to avoid doing that because that is not necessarily true. And so you want to make sure that you always have a separation between those two. So that is all that I'm going to do with this poem. And what I like to do is bring up the second poem, My Papa's Waltz, which is also a poem that deals with a father-son relationship. And this one is definitely a father and son. So let me just begin by reading this one. The whiskey on your breath can make a small boy dizzy, but I hog on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pan slid from the kitchen chef. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. In this poem, you will find some similarities between Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays. Because look at it this way. We have here a mother in here in the second stanza. And notice the syntax here. On my mother's countenance, and countenance is just someone's facial expression, could not unfrown itself. So the mother is obviously frowning at this situation that is happening here. And we have here also a relationship between a father and son, but the way that Redkey has written this poem, at least some confusion about the nature of this relationship. And a lot of that has to do with diction. And keep in mind that diction is word choice. So let's go back to the first stanza and look at this third line. And this is a simile. And that was on the poetic terminology. And what a simile is when you compare two dissimilar things with like or as. So the boy here is saying, but I hung on like death. That expression seems negative, right? Because we tend to think of death as something negative. And so when the boy says, I hung on like death, that seems negative to us, right? Or to most of us. And we also realize too that what the poem establishes in the first stanza is that the father's drunk. I mean, that is the first line of the poem, the whiskey on your breath. And look at the second line. It is so much whiskey that it can make a small boy dizzy. And so that's the first image that you have. But then when you get to this third line, but I hung on like death, the use of that word like death makes us think negative. But then perhaps he's hanging on because he doesn't want to let go. And then also think of the word waltz being used here. Waltz is an elegant dance, usually a romantic dance done by a couple. And so for the speaker to use that word waltz, what does that mean? Also, look at the choice of words to explain the family relationship. So remember in Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, we had father. Father, for a number of readers, seemed like a very cold, distant word. Like for those of you who are Star Wars fanatics or fans, I should say. Um, even though this is not the exact statement that Darth Vader makes in Strikes Back, but like Luke, I am your father. Like that father seems heavy, whereas Papa seems more a term of endearment. So that's an interesting word choice. That's diction. Why my Papa's waltz and not my father's waltz? If we look at the second stanza, it's interesting here because we see the mother there. And the only thing that we know is that she's frowning. Um, but why exactly? And there's two possible interpretation. Like we romped into the pan slid from the kitchen chef. So those first two lines of that second stanza indicate that they're actually making a mess. So maybe that's why she's frowning. Or maybe she's frowning because the father is drunk dancing with this boy. And once again, I'm making an interpretation here that's not in the poem. Maybe the mother has put the boy to sleep or to put him to bed, and all of a sudden the drunk father has come home and disrupted everything. Perhaps that's why she's frowning. We do not know. And what Red Keys does is he gives us multiple options of reading that. The third stanza is interesting. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle, and at every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. This seems like abuse here. I mean, like the hand that held his wrist, the father's hand was battered. But if the father's hand is battered here, go to the fourth stanza and look at this line here with the palm caked hard by dirt. So remember when we were reading Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays and we talked about the father's hands and how we realized that those hands represented that the father did weekday manual labor. With the palm kicked hard by dirt, that gives us the same kind of connotation that this is once again a father who's doing manual labor. And so when he says that the hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle, perhaps, and notice that I'm using the word perhaps that's the reason why. But then look at this too. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. And so the son is obviously being hurt by this dance. But is this done intentionally or is this just done unintentionally. And look at the start of the first line of the last stanza. You beat time on my head. And look particularly at the word beat. Beat is one of those words that has two different meanings. For those of you who are musicians, or even for those of you who are not, beat is also in reference to music, like feel the beat, listen to the beat, hear the beat of the music. But then also, beat is a physical action of beating someone. And here's the deal, Redke uses these words carefully because he knows that these words have multiple connotations. And so that this is a choice that he's made to use you beat time on my head. But then look at the last two lines of this poem. Then waltz me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. There are two ways to read that line. Um, this could be a relationship with the father or the papa that the son is really enjoying. Kind of like that sense, you waltz me off to bed, and the son is still clinging to his father's shirt. Now, is he clinging to his father's shirt because he doesn't want to let go, that he is enjoying this encounter, or if he's clinging to the shirt because he's afraid that he might fall? And so both of those possibilities here. This is a great poem for many, many reasons, because what Redkey does in the poem by his use of word choice, he gives you multiple ways to engage this poem. It can be a good poem between father and son. It could be a bad poem between father and son. Both of those interpretations are valid. You could support either one. And in a way to support that, you go back and you look at the different elements of the poem. You look at word choice. How do you read you beat time on my head? How do you read still clinging to my shirt? How do you read the mother's countenance cannot unfound itself? And think about those two lines that come before that. And so as you're going through this poem, you need to take the entire poem into consideration. And also do this. Look at the publication date. We're talking about 1948. Robert Hayden's was 1975. What did it mean to be a man in 1948? How were the relationships between father and sons in 1948 as opposed to 1975, or opposed to now in 2022, the time in which we're living? So there are a lot of things that you have to consider. I'm going to stop sharing the poem when you're reading a poem. And so that is one of the things that I want you to start doing as you're reading these various poems. Look at the terminology and keep in mind, as I said before, there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to interpretation. What there is how well you support your interpretation. And you support that interpretation by looking at the terminology. You look at syntax, you look at diction, you look at imagery, you look at similes, you look at metaphor. So all of that stuff in the poetic terminology becomes very important as you begin to read a poem, analyze it, and try to get to its theme. And keep in mind that a theme is what the poem says about its topic. All right. Hope you enjoyed this lecture on those winter Sundays and my Papa's Waltz. Have a good day. Bye.